Warm welcome, everyone, to our webinar, Cattle, Conflict and Commerce, Rethinking European Interventions on Pastoralism. We're joined now by 4 speakers, a number of participants in Zoom, and we also have a number of live stream YouTube viewers. My name is Dr. Karsten Bruyne. I'm the head of the Sahel program at the Klingendael Institute. Our Sahel program is usually involved in political economy analysis at the local level, and we focus on local authorities. My own work is on violent conflict in West Africa, and specifically on how local authorities are targeted in conflict. And I'm the moderator of the webinar today. Now, this webinar is organized by the Klingendael Institute, but also Search for Common Ground. So we've co-hosted this webinar. And our aim today is to rethink on how we can improve European interventions on pastoralism. So for that reason, we have invited a number of policymakers to this webinar, and they're present. But we've also a number of NGOs, workers for NGOs present, implementers, local organizations, I saw researchers, students. So it's a big audience. Before I'm introducing the 4 speakers, I think it might be helpful to set the stage a little bit and why we have this webinar on European intervention on pastoralism. And before I do that, let me first briefly say, so pastoralism, what we mean by it is basically livestock herding that involves a component of mobility. So it can be within a country from region to region, or it can be between countries, so cross-border movements. But as long as it has an element of mobility, livestock herding, that's when we use the word pastoralism. So why do we actually have to rethink the European intervention? So there are essentially 2 reasons. So the first one is that it is clear, I think, to everyone, at least vaguely aware even of the pastoralist sort of debate, that they face many problems. So that goes from land tenure conflict, push for intensive agriculture, exclusive local governments arrangements, change to rainfall, climate change. I mean, there are many issues there. And what the consequence of it is that the regular movement of pastoralists is disrupted. And as a consequence, their livelihoods are under stress. And what we then see is like conflicts and instability ranging from one side of Africa to the other. So if you look at central Mali, Liptako Gourma, Burkina Faso, Nigeria's middle belt, of course, Lake Chad, Sudan-South Sudan border. There are many places where we see tensions between farmer and herders. And it's a big problem that we urgently need to address. And the second reason is and that's actually a bit tragic, I think, is that none of this is really new. So we have seen these problems for a really long time. And apparently we have not been really able to address them. So the present crisis, I think, is also really pointing to us as a policy community to rethink what we do wrong and how can we really improve our way of acting. Now, we are really fortunate to have 4 distinguished speakers at this webinar present. First, we have Ine Coutinho, who is a former research fellow at the Klingendael Institute, and she's the author of a new report that we just published on pastoralism in Burkina Faso. Then we have Edwin Magnani, who is a project officer at UNDP Kenya, who's working on cross-border programming for pastoralists. Then we have Bukola Ademola Telehin, who is a consultant project coordinator with UN Women in Nigeria and has experience with farmer pastoral extension in Nigeria. And then finally, we have Andrew McDonnell, who is a senior officer at Search for Common Ground and the author of a very soon to be published toolkit on pastoralism. And so he's going to give us a sneak peek today, but it will be launched later this week. Before I'm going to get to some housekeeping, the idea is that the first 2 presentations by Ine and Edwin are going to give us more insight into the problems that pastoralists face. Then Bukola will share some of her own sort of working on farmer pastoralist violence and how to address it. And finally, Andrew will then share the toolkit. So we move from some of the problems towards some of the solutions. Some housekeeping then. We have the 4 presentations, then a brief discussion between the 4 presenters here, then a Q&A. You can post your questions in the Q&A during the webinar. It would be really helpful if you also point out to whom the question is addressed. And then during the Q&A, I will try to address your questions. Right, now, without further ado, let us move to the presentation. So first, Ine Coutin. She's, like I said, a former research fellow at the Klingendaal Conflict Research Unit. And before she worked as an academic researcher at the Utrecht University and did also her PhD on how urbanization is impacting inclusive development. And she has extensive fieldwork experience, among others in Burkina. Now, Ine, I think it is one of the reasons that motivates us is to have this webinar is that we lack a sound understanding of the challenges that pastoralists face. And I was really fascinated by reading your report and seeing that there are actually major profits in the livestock market, but that for some reason, the pastoralists that are involved in that market, they do not profit. And maybe as a starter, can you explain to us why that is? So why do pastoralists lose out in this arrangement?
Good afternoon. Yes, thank you very much, Gus. Indeed, there is an interesting finding that I found myself as well. When we look indeed in the Sahel, we see a thriving market being pushed by demanding growing urban centers and coastal states. And Burkina has really become also a hub and an important exporter in that growing value chain. It is actually, I have a PowerPoint presentation. Let me go to my presentation in the meantime. That will give you maybe more also a, oh, let me see. Yes. Is this, wait, is this working? No. There's something went wrong here.
I will share the PowerPoint.
Okay, yeah, something went not right. Yes, so let me pick up where I left off. So indeed, we see that there's this growing market, this growing demand that of course can pose many opportunities in which pastoralists as producers can play an important role. However, what we also have to realize is that this means also a change in the economic reality in which the pastoralists are making a living. So market dynamics, of course, also an important driver of change for pastoral livelihoods. So what we mainly see is that they have to now engage in increasingly commercialized market, where new actors are entering the value chain at different levels, competing at different levels. And as you already mentioned, what we actually see is that it's not pastoralists that reap the main benefits, but mainly intermediaries like traders, brokers, who can really profit and strengthen their position. And pastoralist producers actually indicate that they face quite some difficulties and there are some barriers that really hamper the integration of them, full integration in this growing market. I will just mention a few here. One is, for example, that the market rationale that is intrinsic to the like a traditional pastoralist production system does not always match this commercially oriented value chain. Another issue is also due to their mobile practices and remoteness from larger markets, access to market information can be, or full market information can be an issue. On top of that also, we see that the organization and representation of pastoralists at, for example, livestock market management committees is not as strong as, for example, those intermediaries that I already mentioned. And finally, and I think really importantly at the moment as well, is also that the security issues that are roaming the region are really also hampering access to markets, for example, have effects on livestock prices. One very important one is, for example, the effect it has on pastoral mobility. As already mentioned, a key and central strategy to manage uncertainty for pastoralists, but also an intrinsic feature of pastoral production systems. And what was really striking is that pastoralists indicated that security has really become an important and main decision maker in their engagement with, for example, transhumance and livestock mobility, which means sometimes the deviation from trajectories, but also Some actually indicated they currently abandon the whole practice because of security. However, it's not only security that is blocking mobility or that is hampering mobility. There's also some factors of a more structural nature. For example, when corridors are blocked and resources, pastoral resources are reduced by farmland encroachments, which bring me to access to resources as another level where pastoralists face marginalization and a vulnerable position in Burkina Faso, where I really want to point at the issue of governance. So now we're at the third slide. When we dive deeper in the vulnerable position of pastoralists, access to natural resources, or rather governance of such access, can really be seen as a root cause of many of pastoralist grievances. I will just highlight a few here that we encountered in our research. In the visual, you can see where we asked pastoralists and farmers in localities where they share resources about the satisfaction with access to resources, where you see the clear difference. One point they mentioned was that they really felt pastoralists felt powerless when it came to protecting grazing lands and pastoral corridors from farmland encroachment, which is because of actually the complexity at the local level when we look at power dynamics and how access is being governed and managed. Also because often national laws exist that protect their rights and these areas. However, these are rarely implemented and enforcement often fails, which creates a level of impunity. So pastors really sense that they are competing in a very unequal field regarding access to land and resources with farmers, because often government policies, but also local institutions tend to have a bias towards more sedentary systems. Like bring me to a key aspect here, which is the underrepresentation of pastoralists in national and local level policymaking and governance systems. Virtually in all the localities where we did the research, farmers were far better represented in the bodies that were governing and managing lands and access to resources. Only in one location where both actors indicated they claimed to be equally represented, we really saw that accounted for in the levels of satisfaction to resource management that they indicated. Now, of course, when farmers and pastoralists negotiate access to resources, there has been conflicts involved. That is not a new issue. However, we really see that as increasingly escalating. And one aspect there is that in the past, there's been at the local level customary resolution mechanisms and justice systems being developed to deal with these. But with new pressures, these are really increasingly under pressure to really prevent the escalation, which is again negatively affecting farmer-pastoralist relationships, but also the legitimacy of such systems. And it's really there that we see a higher risk also for example, people looking for other or own justice systems where vigilante groups step in, or VO recruitments that play into these grievances that pastoralists voice. And they're really, these situations can turn into spirals of violence. That brings me to, well, basically finalizing by saying that we really see that I mentioned some economic, environmental, and social political factors that are putting pastoral livelihoods under stress, which are not new, and pastors have been faced with these in the past. And we've really seen, which I want to stress, is that we've seen that it's been a resilient system that has been an adaptable system. However, now with also the spread of violence and security, we see that is really more and more under stress, and these particularly affecting those resilience mechanisms, as for example, mobility, what I already mentioned. So to conclude, the pastoralist development can really be a key aspect when a contributing element in stabilization in the Sahel. However, if interventions and policies are not blind for these underlying structural causes and drivers and not rely on more simplistic narratives, for example, that directly connect pastoralists as a security threat, etc. So in terms of solutions, I want to move to my last slide where I point out 4 of the main recommendations that we developed based on our findings, which is at one hand, improving this pastoral representation in governance at the different levels. So proper representation is of pastoralists, but also other marginalized groups in landscapes. The second one is also to protect pastoral and support pastoral livelihoods in this situation of economic exchange, but also security through, for example, diversification, gradual intensification, if possible, and trainings. We also stress a less technical and a more integral approach towards agriculture development projects, meaning agriculture and pastoral interventions and policies have often been treated in silo terms. So while the one has effect on the other, and it affects also the relationships between these two groups. And finally, also the importance of continuing to support these conflict mediation agents that already exist to prevent escalation of localized conflicts. And that is my, I will finalize there.
Thank you very much, Ina. That's really, I think, a really great way to sort of start the this webinar, and particularly think through the problems that pastoralists face. One of the things I mean, from my background as working on the Sahel, I often see the pastoralist farmer of the herder-farmer conflict in the Sahel being equalized, like ethnicized in a way. Yeah. So pastoralists are seen as Fulani. And I remember when I looked at the report that this was also sort of the initial phrasing. You've been working in 3 regions, I think, Boucle du Mahon, Sahel, and Est. Did you see, so to what extent is this sort of relationship between Fulani and pastoralists something that came up in your work?
I think it's really, the way it came out is actually from the straight beginning. And that also showed how indeed we often look at, how that problem is being directly linked to a Fulani problem or to a problem of ethnicity. But what is really important here is that pastoralists are not just Fulani are pastoralists, but pastoralists are not necessarily Fulani. So it's not, we cannot just group them as one homogeneous group. There's different dynamics within different pastoral groups, but also definitely in Burkina Faso, when we talk about pastoralists, we definitely not only talk about Fulani, there's different ethnic groups that are involved. And when it comes to the regions as well, we really see also a difference there in the interaction at the local level. For example, Sahel region is a very strongly pastoral area, while in Boucle du Mahon, there's far more interaction also with farmers, where you have large-scale farming land investments and so forth. So it's important to, at the local level, really recognize that it's not an issue of ethnicity necessarily. It's an issue about different research users and the governance of access to the sources that they use.
Thank you very much, Ines. So that's really clear. Huh? So this problem of pastoralism really surpasses any sort of ethnic labeling that is really common in some mainstream media, I forget to say, but in certain media. So what I'd like to do is to move towards the next speaker, Edwin Magnani. So I think what is, let me give a brief background on him as well. So Edwin is a development, peace building and conflict officer at UNDP Kenya, where he works on cross-border programming for pastoralists. Before he led the World Bank's initiative to train their East African partners on working with pastoralism and particularly on conflict sensitivity. And he has had many other functions that are relevant to the work here. So as a kickoff, Edwin, I know you worked also in Burkina Faso, but you're presently based in Kenya, where it's also sort of really your background. So does your experience in the Horn of Africa square with the findings that Ina has outlined so far?
Thank you so much. I would say absolutely yes. The findings resonate with the experiences that we have in the Horn of Africa. And I would go further to point out that the pressure for pastoral communities is increasing, a factor that might in the long run impact, well, maybe even they have started experiencing negative effects already, yeah? But the impact is certainly going to be there. And these pastoral populations might be under pressure to keep adapting to new pressures that are emerging. One of the things that we have to admit is that there is also the factor of population increase. In the Horn of Africa, we are talking about 12 million communities that subscribe to the pastoral livelihood. These against other factors that are not changing, basically meaning that if you're talking about movement, then the space for movement is shrinking, given the fact that states have put in place measures to try to protect what they deem as being important. And again, we also have to admit that with time, since pastoralism is an adaptation, to tough climatical conditions, they are changing patterns, even in terms of tradition. If you look at the way rangelands were being managed sometimes back, it's not the same. So in terms of rangelands management, there is a shift from the traditional way of managing rangelands. And this might also be impacted upon not only by the political systems in place, but also by the market forces that keep demanding more in terms of livestock and livestock products. Again, we also experience exclusion, and these are disadvantage to the pastoral communities in the Horn of Africa. Exclusion from wetter areas and more fertile of parts of the countries, simply because crop production is deemed to be more important as a livelihood, than the pastoral exploits. Again, there is the issue of as the pressure for food security comes into play, you find that dryland agriculture, and irrigation is given prominence. Yeah, in Kenya, for instance, in the devolved systems, you see a trend where every county is grappling with the whole idea of food security, and this has impacted negatively on the reserve pasture lands that pastoral communities would enjoy. As mentioned earlier, I think the gap between the policy making process and the actors, in this pastoral livelihood is very clear, in the sense that whatever the research found out also resonates with the experience in the Horn of Africa, in the sense that at state level, most of these policies are made at state level, but then devolved in terms of implementation. Okay, and we know as development actors that it should be working the other way around. I mean, consultation starting from the bottom upwards, but at times, state mechanisms dictate that it's developed from the state level and then devolved downwards. This sometimes does not work very well when it comes to implementation, because you lose the people connection, and the pastoralist communities most of the time look at these as very strange rules of the game that are being introduced, and this has increased the tension between pastoral communities and the state. Other factors have also been mentioned. We are looking at conflict and insecurity in general, and how this impacts on not only intercommunal but cross-border relations as well. It has led to a level where now pastoral communities are being branded as a security threat, which should not be the case. Okay, when we're in the comfort of our kitchens enjoying cooking meat and serving it, we forget the fact that there has been a lot of effort in terms of getting us to that stage. Yeah, so it's not right to brand pastoral communities as being a security threat, but what we are looking at here is what influences pastoral communities to be able to see the need to defend themselves, not only with traditional weapons that have been relegated to the stores, and at this level we are talking about advanced small arms that they have picked in order to protect themselves. So we are looking at a problem of small arms and light weapons in these pastoral areas that most states are grappling with. And then there is the question of climate change. This has really impacted on the pastoral livelihood, in the sense that it being an adaptation to climate-related challenges, with time, you find that it becomes very difficult for them to adopt further, especially when the climate changes impact on them negatively to the level that they have very little or no alternative in terms of changing their movements, in terms of adopting to new lifestyles or even new livelihoods. So this becomes a big challenge. Whatever was being looked at as a pasture reserve has shrunk to a great extent due to perennial drought episodes that have also led to sharp reduction in their herd, and also facilitated the outbreak of diseases that they find very hard to deal with. And this is where the state intervention comes in. But again, in as much as a state can intervene within its borders, when it comes to cross-border movement, it becomes a bit of a challenge. And for the Horn of Africa, I think the intergovernmental agency that is for development, that is IGAD, has played a major role in terms of facilitating that. But still a lot needs to be done because some of these policies have not been accepted, you know, at the community level. Yeah. But all in all, we have to realize that, you know, in the Horn of Africa, the poverty incidence among pastoral communities can be anything between 40 and 51%. These according to World Bank studies. Yeah? But again, there is increased incidence of encroachment into pastoral areas, given the interest that I had mentioned above. So in terms of policies, quite a number have been put in place in the Horn of Africa in order to address some of the challenges that not only pastoral communities, but all nations in the Horn of Africa have been facing. But I've managed to pull out some that really directly speaks out to pastoral communities. And these are 7 in number, all the way from you know, the protocol establishing the IGAD conflict early warning and early response mechanism. In 2002, you know, the Nairobi Protocol on Prevention, Control and Reduction of Small Arms and Light Weapons in 2004. The AU Policy Framework for Pastoralism in Africa in 2010. The Declaration on Ending Drought. This was done in Nairobi in 2011. And the latest one amongst these policy instruments is the IGAD, a transhumance protocol that seeks to open doors for pastoral communities to move across borders without any challenge, while exploiting the social and economic potential of pastoralism for the benefit of pastoral communities, and also the national economies as well, because that has not been very clear for most people as to how far the pastoral economies contribute to national development. And then there is also the IGAD Animal Health Strategy of 2017-2022 that also supports or puts in place mechanisms for disease identification and treatment across the borders, regardless of which country you're talking about, as long as they're members of you know, of the IGAD economic bloc. Yeah. Now, as far as policy.
Sorry, Edwin.
Yeah.
With an eye on the time, I'd like to also ask you two small questions, if that's okay. So yes. First of all, I think if I'm sort of summarizing what you're saying, is that the problems that have been observed by Ina in her report are really sort of similar to what you're personally seeing in the Horn of Africa. And I think exactly. if anything, I think there is sort of a clear need to make the concerns of pastoralists more central to the way we are looking at these issues, and particularly our policy response. So my question to you is, if you look at the drivers like population growth, climate adaptation, a bias towards crop production, also what Ines is sort of showing, the changing market dynamics, to what extent do you feel that it's actually viable to continue supporting a pastoralist livelihood, or should we maybe help pastoralists move into and choose different ways of being a pastoralist? I think it's important because if we think as sort of ahead as policymakers, what is our outlook? Is it to ensure that this mode of production remains in place, or should we help them adapt to a new reality?
Well, my take on this is that we have to look at it not only from an environmental, political perspective, but also bring in the human rights element. How far are the communities ready and willing to adopt to new forms of livelihoods? We have to be fair to them, to give them time to be able to observe what is going on so that they pick what is right for them and what is sustainable for them. Remember, the pastoral livelihood has been developed over centuries, okay? So it is an evidence-based sort of livelihood, okay? Now, for you to bring in the aspect of change, and it has been tried in very many instances and it failed, you must give time for the communities themselves to make observations and decide whichever direction they want to take. And that is one of the problems that we have. Remember, in the pre-colonial period, there was free movement. There were negotiations. Of course, there were conflicts that were experienced. But in the in the colonial period and post-colonial period, where you see international borders that limited the movement, how long has it taken? IGAD has come up with the transhumance protocol when in 2020, that is after how long? Okay, and the realization which made them come with up with this idea is that, well, this is a livelihood that is justifiable. This is a livelihood that has been experimented and it's working for the people. We cannot change it in a few years. We need to give them time to be able to adapt to what is best for them. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, many thanks. That's really helpful, and I think it's also a lot of food for thought for the discussion. Let me introduce our third speaker today. Her name is Bukola Ademola Delehin. So she's a gender and peace building expert working for UN Women on women, peace and security, and strengthening the response of farmer and pastoralist to farmer and pastoralist conflict in Nigeria. And before, she has been the head of programs at the West African Network for Peace Building, ONEP, in Nigeria, and a senior policy and program analyst at Search for Common Ground. So, Bukola, for me, it's, I think, really clear that the problems that Ian and Edwin are outlining are very likely sort of also resonating with you in Nigeria. But I'd like you to do is to maybe less reflect on those problems too, but more sort of think about how to respond to them. And then I think looking at Nigeria in particular, there we have already a situation where instability to a certain extent has arrived. So those conflicts are already really manifest. So we're getting there to in a situation where conflict management is really key, or management of tensions. Maybe tension management might even be a better term here. Now, you've been personally engaged in farmer pastoralists, with farmer and pastoralist groups in Nigeria. So I'm really curious to sort of learn from you if you can share some of your experience and what has been effective ways of engaging, doing conflict management, and what could the international community learn on how to deal with these conflicts in the present day, age.
Well, thank you very much, Cass. Yes, the experiences that will be shared by the two earlier speakers, of course, resonates with the context in Nigeria. Maybe just to also put a bit in perspective around maybe why also even looking at conflict management has also been a bit tough, a bit challenging, and that's why we're still having some of the difficulties, challenges on managing the relationship between farmers and others in the larger context of also looking at how their livelihood can be sustained in the context of of the dispute and the conflict that is ongoing. Maybe a few things about Nigeria is just to also say that a lot of why we are having this challenge, of course, I'll go quickly to looking at what has worked in really doing conflict management, is also how this conflict has really attached not to be able to separate the people from the conflict issue. Participants in this conflict are mostly seen in terms of their cultural identity, ethnic identity, religious identity, which then makes it very difficult for this discussion on really looking at the key issues in this conflict, which is issues around looking at the livelihood of farmers and others in a way that the dispute that arises from competition on how they can really sustain their livelihoods, how they can do their farming for the farmers, and how the pastoralists can also do their cattle rearing in a manner that is sustainable, has then become very difficult. And that's also why a lot of interventions that are taken also not have been met with lack of trust from the pastoralists or also from the farming communities themselves, which is also a huge challenge. Of course, this conflict in our own context in Nigeria is also happening in the situation where, as you rightly mentioned, there's a lot of security challenges and also issues around governance, even of the resources is also a challenge. And even the response to the conflict has also even deepened animosity, has also even given to a situation where parties in this conflict, farmers themselves and pastoralists in the different communities, have also continued to rely on self-help because they also do not feel maybe their needs and their concerns are really being addressed as effectively as they also wanted to be addressed. But nevertheless, I've also seen, maybe before I also go, it's also looking at how criminality has also been intertwined with this conflict. Issues around cattle rustling, destruction of farmlands, killing of people have also been closely associated with this conflict, which in many of the cases then removes attention from the issues that we are supposed to be looking at as a people, how farmers can farm sustainably, how pastoralists, herders can also do their cattle rearing in a manner that is sustainable. Of course, agricultural farming is important to Nigeria. Cattle rustling is a multi-million dollar investment that's also very critical. But nevertheless, these challenges, maybe some of what I've seen in my experience engaging both the farming communities, pastoralist communities, working on peace building intervention, I think some of the things I would like to highlight is really the importance of building that local level commitment, that local level structure. We call it peace architecture, we call it peace, having those platforms where both farmers and others can really, even from the onset, also begin to look at their rebuilding their broken relationship, rebuilding their sense of shared identity. And what is this shared identity? Shared identity as agro-producers, shared identity as members of the same community in many of the cases. Maybe in other contexts, we will see a lot of issues of maybe pastoralists moving with non-residents. We have communities in Nigeria where the group called pastoralist cattle rearers, mostly called the Fulani ethnic group, have also been residents in the community for a long time. Which also put them as part of the community, really rebuilding this sense of shared identity, this sense of common destiny. As pastorally, I think is also one thing. And how we have in the interventions I've been part of, I've designed, is really instituting what we call structure for community level peace dialogue, structure to really promote healing dialogue and to put communities themselves in where they can even discuss their issues and even build understanding. You know, in many of the cases, because these things are reported on the pages of social media, in the news, it at times takes away the opportunity for communities themselves to reflect, to really see how they can even manage this conflict. In some of the work I've done in states in Nasarawa State, Plateau State, and so on in Nigeria, there are situations where even with the farmers and herders sit together to really discuss. Yes, your cattle encroached on my farmland, destroyed my farm produce. That what settles it is just an apology, not necessarily seeking for payment for the destruction that has been made, just because in those communities, there have been structures put in place that has enabled the farmers and the herders themselves to be able to sit together to look at the key issues that they're dealing with and also find local ways and also find means between their own capacity to really be able to address some of those challenges around how they can manage their resources in the ways that both of them can really be able to address it. And other points I also want to raise is really on the role of women in all this. I've led a research and also be part of different engagement. I've worked with women directly, really, and I believe that the enormous capacity that is resident in women, of course, women are not homogeneous, but that capacity to really be healing, to really facilitate the beauty of understanding, looking at the social networks that they have in the communities, and also to really be able to use those networks and to really be able to build peace, to really be able to facilitate understanding and also to bring connection in those situations where relationship has broken down. And I think, yes, this is one thing that, yes, though, highly underutilized in finding response to this conflict, and also because conflict is seen in the masculine lens. Men go to war, women don't go to war. But in the research I've done, the women themselves tell you that no conflict can go on for 5-10 years if women are not supporting it. And then when it comes to discussion on addressing this, women are most of the times absent, either at the community level, at the state level, at the national level. But part of the interventions that will be part of, as I mentioned, is really to bring women together, for women to even form network. For the first time, in some of the communities that I've worked in Nigeria, women say, yes, we see these signs that this situation is going to degenerate, that violence is going to occur. Then capacity building on early warning, for them to even look at those signs. When you see things happening this way, what do you do? Has helped in many of the communities. And for example, I trained about 20 women in a community. When I go back in some of these communities, they have stepped down this capacity they've gotten, even monitoring, and also be able to report, and also be able to even make sense of what is changing and how it can be addressed. Has gone to multiple levels where women have been able to organize community level platforms to really disseminate this. Another thing is also the capacity of women for mediation. I think is also part for some of the work I'm doing currently is really looking at how do we then strengthen this capacity for women to formally, informally also be able to work, use their capacity, use their skills to really be able to mitigate and to really be able to mediate very directly in this conflict. In some of the communities I'm working currently, I've seen where women have instituted platforms in their communities that brought together farming communities in one meeting, pastoralist community in another meeting, then brought the two of them together for them to even discuss and then to see how they can manage some of the challenges that they have been faced with. And I think the other thing I also want to raise quickly is how peace building should also be integrated in development of the livestock, development of the agri sector. I think that has also been in some of what I'm doing currently and I've done previously, are really using the development of the agri sector, either development of farming or development of pastoralist sector, to really integrate the activities of farmers and others. For example, we're saying we do not have sufficient land for open grazing. Now we want to encourage the development of fodders. Can farmers plant fodders? Can others purchase them? Farm crop residues. How can these exchanges be done in a manner that both farmers and others, we know that they share the same destiny of sustaining the production of food in Nigeria, for example, and then using all available resources to continue to foster this integration of the economy. I think that is what I've seen that is working. It's not done yet, but it's in progress, which I think will also be encouraged. And people that work together, that do business together, have lesser prosperity to also want to resort to violence. They have more reason to want to work for peace. They want more reasons to want to sustain their relationship, unlike when their economic activities are totally not connected. I think, yes, institutional structures and also support and also making connection with state-level structures for peace building. In many of the states, in some of the states in Nigeria, we've seen the emergence of peace building agencies. But this is still not sufficient. In many of the other states where we are having this conflict, I'm thinking some of the support should be towards the government institutions, towards the government of those states, to really be able to situate a peace building, maybe peace building agency that also have some of those responsibilities to using government platform to really be able to promote trust and address some of the grievances. I think this will be very important. Another level of investment will also be investment into the transformation of both the cattle rearing value chain and even the family value chain. I think those are also key and very important intervention that I think we continue to sustain, how we continue to build peace, and how we continue to facilitate the rebuilding of the broken relationship between farmers and others, which has made it very easy for them to really have this adversarial relationship that is not profit to anybody in Nigeria. A lot of tension is currently ongoing in Nigeria between the northern and the southern. Interestingly, In the northern part of Nigeria, there is more experience on really handling the farmers and others conflict. But when you go further to the southern part of Nigeria, there's lesser experience in managing this, and there's a lot of tension ongoing currently. So I think really looking at from the community level, situating support at the state level, looking at developing these sectors in a way that integrate the economy of both groups will also be a good way to continue to consolidate to address this conflict in Nigeria. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bukola. So what I take from sort of your contribution is that there are at least 3 ways in which we can sort of improve our response. That is, 1, local level dialogue. We really need to sort of improve that. Secondly, is that the gender component to this is very often overlooked, which I think totally agree with. And then thirdly, that rural development, that we sort of need to rethink about how we can do that in a way that farmer and herders are actually collaborating with one another, and we see some mutual exchanges. I'm not doing complete justice to you, and I'm sure there are other things that you will add during the discussion. But one thing I would like to briefly touch upon is a question that came from the audience. His name is Hugo Verkel, who asked that in the past, of course, there has been collaboration between farmers and herders, and there were ways, like Edwin was just pointing out, in which they already communicated. So why have those mechanisms that exist, those customary sort of mechanisms, not been sufficient at this stage? If you can maybe answer that in like maximum of 2 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Of course, in Nigeria, farmers and others have long history of harmonious relationship. But I think some of the factors that Edwin and India already also identified, the issues of do we still have the same level of land available like we used to have? For example, of course, there is increase in population, increase in development. A lot of farmlands have been converted to houses. A lot of pastoralist designation reserves and have also been converted and also be encroached upon. So those structures that makes it easy for them to really be, well, when there is abundance, there's no conflict. Conflict, of course, comes from when there is competition from resources. So now there is increased competition for resources, which has been brought by a lot of factors. I think there's a lot of documentation around the impact of climate change and even reducing the available resources. And beyond that, also, as I mentioned, growth in population, human development has also utilized some of these resources. And then in many of the resources that are even designated, how many of these resources are even being maintained in a manner that both the pastoralists, for example, can even go to those resources, grazing reserves, for example, how many of them can even be able to go to those reserves, have facilities that can sustain their livelihood. So there's so many things that are points of tension that has made it very difficult for the structures that were very critical in addressing these grievances to be able to have the same impact like they used to. For example, let me look at the traditional institutions. Pre this time, the traditional institutions in Nigeria were very powerful. They also have the capacity really to be able to manage some grievances at their local level. But in some of the engagements I've had very recently in some communities, even the traditional system, headed by maybe a traditional leader, has also even become very weak. And they're ineffective to really be able to address some of those challenges. A lot of the time, we lay credence to the role of the parents in really be able to ready their young people and so on and so forth. But I can tell you, have been in meetings, have facilitated engagements where the mothers that people want to call on most of the time to tell you, these youth, these young people are operating under the influence of drugs, under the influence of alcohol, and then it's more difficult even for parents to manage them. So that's the kind of reach. So these are some of the issues that made it difficult. Thank you.
Thank you, Bukola. So in a way, the stresses that are put on the system have increased so much that the traditional ways of dealing with it, they are insufficient at this moment, if I'm summarizing as well. So I'm moving forward to a final speaker, Edwin Magnani of Search for Common Ground, where he's a senior officer who works on programs to influence international policy. So it's a perfect moment for him to sort of speak here on farmer-herder conflict. And prior to Search, he coordinated research and peace-building programs for the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy. Now, Andrew, and I mean, I've already mentioned this to you, that sometimes you come across research that's is actually so helpful that you almost wish that you yourself had written it, and that definitely holds for the toolkit that you have created. I find it incredibly helpful. It covers many different topics that we already discussed now, And I'm sure policymakers and implementers really are gonna love it. But maybe as a start, can you maybe briefly explain to us why you felt it was so important to make this toolkit now?
Absolutely, and thank you for the very kind introduction to our work. As Kars mentioned, we at Search are about to release a new toolkit that's focused on informing responses to farmer-herder conflict, not in any one context, but broadly across the Sudano-Sahel region in sub-Saharan Africa. We'll be releasing that in the next coming days, and we'll share with everyone on this call a copy of that. But I just want to give the next couple of minutes a kind of brief sort of preview of what this is, why we developed it, and sort of what are some of the top line things for all of you to consider. So I think everyone on the call thus far has done an excellent job at sort of setting the stage. And I think it's really powerful to see that, you know, the challenges and conflict dynamics that we're seeing in Burkina Faso and Kenya and Nigeria, even though they're very unique, are also you know, linked to many of the sort of similar factors and challenges. And this has created, I think, a sense of urgency across the region that you know, conflicts between farmers and herders, attacks on livestock and livestock theft are a key component of instability and conflict, not just in any one sort of area of conflict, but across the wider region. And so I really wanted to just briefly highlight what I see as three kind of overarching gaps in the response from policymakers. So the first being that, you know, many of the tools that we as the peace building community have developed to respond to conflict, you know, really emerged focusing on sedentary or settled communities, approaches to connect you know, people with their neighbors and regular interactions, you know, really require that people live in the same space year round and have regular interaction. If you want to form a local peace committee, it's really hard to get people to participate if they are constantly traveling or on the move. They can't show up to a peace committee meeting. And so the first challenge is really that a lot of the tools that we have are not adapted to the needs of populations who migrate, who move, who are mobile. The second challenge, which again, I think has been very well highlighted across these different presentations, is that while we have done a lot to sort of respond and manage conflict, as Bukola just mentioned now, you know, if we really want to see a real transformation of that conflict, there has to be an alignment between our peace building goals and the investments in development, in governance, in the way that we're sort of building out the future of crop production, agriculture, and livestock in these shared spaces, which to date we just you know, haven't quite seen. And I think, you know, again, others in this presentation have explained, I think, in more depth, sort of how we've seen that in Kenya or in Burkina Faso and in Nigeria. And so then the last sort of gap I wanted to highlight is that you know, if you are an embassy staff from Germany or France or the UK who's just been transferred to your embassy in Bangui or in Juba or in Abuja, and all of a sudden you hear about, you know, conflicts between farmers and herders and the attacks on livestock, you know, you may really benefit from the experience that, you know, Edwin or Bukola has highlighted in their kind of programming. But, you know, where do you get access to that information? How do you know what's an effective way of engaging with mobile populations? How do you know what's an effective way of preventing livestock theft and working with security forces to help track cattle rustling? A lot of that information is either not very accessible or maybe too specialized and technical to really give you sort of practical guidance. And so that's really where we wanted to come in developing this toolkit. And so the toolkit that we've developed is really meant to be a reference guide for donor agencies, diplomatic staff, program implementers to help them make more informed decisions about the kinds of interventions that they're developing in their own context. It's meant to make all that big information that we have, all the lessons learned from decades of experience, accessible to people in a very practical sense. It comes out of a very long meta-analysis of research and program evaluations, where we've tried to distill that information down from hundreds of sources into something that's a bit more digestible, as well as consultations with various pastoralists, civil society experts, donors across the region. What's actually inside this toolkit, and again, just giving you a kind of brief preview, but the toolkit itself offers a menu of strategies for intervention, some of which I've thrown up on this slide here. It's really, as I say, this is a menu. It's meant to give options to help people make more informed decisions. This is not a prescriptive list of policies or programs that everyone in every case should be implementing. This is not meant to tell you at a local level in Burkina Faso or in South Sudan exactly how you need to respond to conflict. It is meant to give you a better framing so that you don't have to start from scratch. You have a sense of options that you can choose from and understand how to adapt to the needs of your own context. And in that sense, we've included as well examples from across the region, various sort of guides and visual aids, as well as sets of questions for the readers to conduct their own needs analysis on what's needed in their particular context, so that they can determine what intervention strategies make the most sense for them. We have in this toolkit a set of sort of 7 sections or 7 modules. The real reason for developing this that I wanted to highlight, you can see here on the screen what those are, is conflict is not the responsibility of any one individual or any one group. And so we wanted to really stress that there's a lot of different ways and a lot of different actors who are responsible for engaging in conflict prevention. And we'll also be building out, I'll share all of this information with people afterwards, but a website version of this toolkit. Just to wrap up really quickly, because I know that we're at time. So I'll just very quickly spotlight at the end some real quick takeaways. The first, to stress again, conflict prevention is not the domain just of peace builders, is not just the domain of organizations like Search. It needs to be a part of how we're thinking about rural development, part of how we're thinking about security sector reform, and about conservation. It needs to be integrated into all of our approaches, the approaches of all actors involved in the spaces where pastoralists are active. And we also, at a very basic level, need to remind ourselves that pastoral communities are themselves stakeholders. And it's easy to forget that as we go out and do a needs assessment and interview and survey a lot of sedentary communities, because they're there and they're easy to talk to. But pastoral communities are stakeholders who use and operate in the land, just like farmers and other rural and other sedentary populations. And we need to be thinking strategically about them in our sort of program design. So I'll end there because I know that we're at time.
Thank you so much, Andrew. And I'm sure I didn't even give enough compliments, because I really find this really comprehensive and helpful. With an eye on the time also, let me open the floor directly and maybe ask some of the respondents to, well, the people here to respond to Andrew. Maybe Ina, can you maybe sort of share your thoughts on the toolkit?
Yes, definitely. So I also indeed read through the toolkit, and I think it's really useful, and I'm really impressed, like a useful and comprehensive toolkit as well. It addresses really different aspects that really highlight again and support this kind of holistic approach that we want to really show the need for when addressing this issue. And also indeed, like how the question of like how can you combine the different tools, the different modules that you present in the toolkit. However, there was one aspect that I wanted to ask you a question about, which is the economic aspect. So we've seen things on rural development and so forth, but I see that the economic aspect and the value chain aspect we only see touched upon in the module on regional integration. However, of course, we've also seen in the past that there's been policies developed, but also donor interventions with regards to pastoral economic developments and development of markets and efforts for example, in the Sahel regional integration. And of course, changing the market, as I mentioned before, of course, also affects value chains and also the relationships between actors in the value chain. So I was wondering what place you see the economic aspect having in this toolkit, and if it was a deliberate maybe choice to not have a full module, or if you could react to that.
Sure, absolutely. And I think the main thing that I would stress is that I think the economic aspect is absolutely critical. I think the sort of investments in livelihoods in the pastoral value chains, I think, have driven a lot of decisions about long-term development strategies in the region, as well as the question that Kars raised earlier to Edwin about do we encourage, guide, incentivize pastoralists to adopt other livelihoods, or do we focus on sort of making pastoralism or sort of facilitating pastoralism and allowing people to thrive in their livelihoods? And I think you see that I think that's reflected in sort of other parts, and so it's reflected in the decisions about the investments in pastoral infrastructure, and whether we choose to invest in carving out grazing reserves and supporting those, or building fencing along migration corridors, versus training programs to sort of retrain people into crop production or fishing or some other form of livelihood. So even though it may not be called out in quite that way, I would see it sort of integrated throughout, and I think that's absolutely a sort of critical component of the response to conflict stability.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Edwin or Bukola, do you want to respond to this too?
Yeah, thanks so much, Kaz. I think for me, the most important thing is the integration of peace building into the toolkit. I mean, this is something that has to come out strongly, because as it is, there have been different attempts to build peace, but in the past, it doesn't seem to be yielding very, very positive results. And I think it's something that probably the toolkit presents an opportunity for us to utilize, to be able to achieve what could not be achieved in the past. But just to throw in a question to you, Andrew, was was there a pre-test for the toolkit, or do you provide an opportunity for the end user to, you know, just do it their own way and come up with the results that they might learn from and improve as they go? Yeah.
So we do have, I think that the idea is that, you know, we want to give people access to information to help them make better decisions. And so I know that that will look very differently in different contexts, both for the sort of specific regional dynamics, but, you know, there may be different questions that you would ask if you were a public diplomacy staff at an embassy in Abuja versus, you know, somebody designing programs at UNDP in Kenya. And so my hope is, you know, we lay out both sort of lessons learned and best practices about how to implement these different strategies, as well as I mentioned, a set of sort of guiding questions for reflection, which are both meant to provide useful information to you as a reader, without necessarily prescribing that you know, you need to do this, or, you know, it should look like this in a certain context. And so you know, we're hopeful that as we roll this out, we'll get more feedback from people who read and use this to understand, you know, what's going to be useful for their particular needs and how they see this sort of fitting into their own decision-making process. And so I encourage everyone on this call, as we share the toolkit, to please reach out to me, let me know how this is useful to you or not. We're very curious to both to learn that and to see this as an evolving thing.
Okay. If I may also throw in one sentence on the toolkit, I think what I find to be very interesting and useful is how these toolkits also prescribe the intervention strategies, and not just giving suggestions, also giving what you should be aware of, giving the pros and cons, and those contexts that also should be informed your decision to take or to use any of the intervention areas of intervention that is proposed in the toolkit. I find that very useful, interestingly, maybe because I also had the opportunity to have a look at the toolkit and also get some of the reviews. I think that's also part of what I think I'll find to be very interesting. And again, while I also encourage other people on this call, aside this call, to also maybe grab a copy of this toolkit and also be able to use it, it's also because it has just so many components to it, which I think addressing conflict between pastoralists and farmers, addressing the livelihood concern, is not just about just the farmers and elders themselves or pastoralists themselves, but a lot of cross-cutting issues that are very critical to be addressed before the concerns and the grievances of both pastoralists and farmers can really be addressed. Issues of governance, rural development, security, conflict management, women's empowerment, and so many other components that I see this, at least for the first time, I've seen a toolkit that is not even just looking at a national scope, but also looking at the entire region scope, which is also very important, comparing context and all those, which I think is very important. Maybe my question would be...
Sorry, I'm going to interrupt you for a little bit. Sorry about that. Because I want to allow some of the, we have many questions. I want some of them to at least have a chance to be posed. One is from Thomas Sommerhalter, who has been posing different questions, but one of the things was more of an outcry, I think. So he said there have been so many really good policies. I mean, it's not that we have been really trying, and as Edwin also pointed out, there have been cross-border arrangements. Just yesterday in Liptako Gourma, there was a new arrangement sponsored by the OECD. So there's so many sort of things that we try, but he says, what about implementation? And I think that's a really key point. And maybe I think, Ina, you mentioned certain things in your work. Andrew, maybe you too, maybe you can briefly reflect on that and how that relates to the toolkit. Andrew, you first.
Sure. And I think that's absolutely right. I think a major theme that I think runs out runs throughout the toolkit, and that, again, I would really stress as a takeaway, is that, you know, we need to move beyond all of the like ideas on paper into implementation. And so, you know, a big thing that I think we found in our research, and that I would stress, is that, you know, what makes a lot of these interventions successful is that they're actually backed up and implemented and resourced, and that they are made a priority for policymakers, and not just over, you know, a usual 12, 24-month program period, but that there's really a long-term commitment to investments in development, to investments in pastoral livelihoods, to investments in, you know, really implementing all aspects of the ECOWAS transhumance protocol or the new IGAD transhumance protocol. And so yes, absolutely. I think that's, you know, that's 100% right. It's not that implementation is the only solution, but it is a necessary precondition for these ideas to be successful.
Thank you. Ina.
Yeah. Yes, I think indeed, when, for example, looking at the case of Burkina Faso, we also see, as I mentioned in the part on natural resource governance, when we look at the frameworks in place, at the laws that protect the pastoral areas, at first sight you might see, well, there's laws in place, there's arrangement in place, there's been discussions about this. But then when we look to the practice, to the local level implementation, either there's no plan for implementation, or at the local level, the governing bodies there, it just turns out very different, considering also the local level, the kind of power dynamics that are at place, and definitely also representation of those pastoral groups as stakeholders in the process, in the decision making. So I think there's often really this discrepancy, which has various of reasons, of course. One is indeed, how do we came to this to the agreements and the rules, but the other indeed, I think it really points at what Andrew also said, that we have to now focus on how to really in practice make these things happen, implement them, but also enforce them.
Yeah. If I could throw in a word to add to the responses, I think one thing that sometimes we forget as development practitioners is that the process sometimes determines the outcome. So when you're talking about a policy making process, it has to be inclusive enough. It must have representation of these pastoral groups you're talking about for it to impact on the environment where they are coming from. So when this is missed, then it becomes very difficult to go ahead and implement it. They start looking at it as something very strange that is meant to impact change. And you know, most of the pastoral communities are very skeptical, given that the pastoral livelihood is meant to respond to very difficult circumstances in order to ensure survival. Anything that comes that is new is looked at first with suspicion, and it gains acceptance with time. And sometimes the speed is very, very, very slow. So we have to be patient on our side, and to admit that that is how the situation is. But it helps if we are inclusive enough in the initial periods. Once we finish, we disseminate right up to the community level for this to get acceptance. I think that has been missing in some of these policy formulation processes. Thank you.
Thank you. That was really important sort of comment, I think, and it speaks to one of the final questions that I'd like to sort of point out here. It's Isaac Lokwar from Uganda, work for GIZ, who's sort of pointing out that that in the end, many pastoralists themselves will have responses to the challenges they face, and he's wondering whether by including them, we also automatically will get a much better response to the challenges that are being that we have to address. Maybe Edwin, you have the final sort of word here.
Yeah, for me, inclusivity is an attribute that has guaranteed the survival of the human race for a very long time, and we can't drop the ball at this point and say that maybe, well, at this point, then we don't need to include these and these stakeholders. It is very key to governance. It is very key to a policy making process. So it is something that needs to be encouraged through and through. even to stakeholders that we consider that are having very minor voices, you might realize in the long run that excluding them actually is the missing link that makes everything fall aside and you fail in your intervention. So as development workers, as people who are working with the pastoral communities, we have to be alive to this. Earlier on, someone mentioned about not only looking at pastoral communities, but also other communities that mingle and interact with the pastoral communities. And that is true. We need to include them as stakeholders as well. Look at the Sengwer among the pastoral communities in Kenya. Look at the IP, who are very small minority group among pastoral communities in Uganda, and others. The other smaller minority groups that are existing amongst pastoral communities. We need to include them as well, because they must be serving a certain function that is both to the advantage of pastoral communities and to their own advantage, that guarantees survival. So it's a delicate balance in this ecosystem that needs to be respected and projected as we go along in decision-making processes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And that's I think a comment that all four speakers can sort of really sort of agree on. Sort of the inclusivity came about as sort of the central point, I think, in the research of Andrew and Ina, but also in the gender contribution that Bukala was making. So there are many more questions. There are many things to discuss, of course, too. But I'd like to thank all speakers and all participants for joining our webinar. Just for information, the webinar will be available at Klingendaal's YouTube channel from tomorrow onwards. We'll be sending an email after when it's going to happen, likely tomorrow, with the report again, likely also with a link to the toolkit where you can find it, the French summary to be shared. Then final, if you would like to subscribe to our newsletter to stay up to date with our latest research, I just recommend you to subscribe to it. We hope to see you back at future events. The next one will likely be on Northern Benin, closely tied to the questions that we discussed today. And